Hello everybody, welcome back to Exponential Finance, the podcast covering finance, technology and innovation, from our home in Japan and beyond. Today's episode is the first brought to you in cooperation with the Mohammed Bin Rashid Initiative for Global Prosperity, featuring the winners of this year's Global Maker Challenge, innovators who are focused on solving the most severe sustainability issues of our time. Before we welcome today's guest, please allow us introduce the challenge in the category Innovation for Inclusive Trade. Open trade and market access have proven to be key drivers of economic growth and poverty reduction in countries at every level of development. The ability to trade globally has fostered more openness, stability, and transparency, which in turn has enabled unprecedented economic growth worldwide and contributed to uplifting hundreds of millions out of extreme poverty. Countries that engage in international trade typically grow faster and provide more opportunities to their people than countries that do not trade openly. Further, by offering consumers access to more affordable goods and services, open trade also helps improve the livelihoods of lower-income communities. Yet, for the millions of people living in rural areas, where extreme poverty and food insecurity are concentrated, significant barriers exist that prevent them from reaping the full benefits of open trade, including poor and unreliable access to infrastructure and public services, high costs for goods, services, and transport, lower population densities, and poor connectivity. These issues are especially prevalent in countries affected by violence and conflict, which can directly hinder the ability to trade and raise the price of basic goods and services. Further, women in these contexts are disproportionately affected by poverty and face greater risks and barriers that limit their ability to benefit from the opportunities brought by trade. In order to fully harness the potential of trade to advance the livelihoods of the 1 billion people who still live off of $1.25 per day, innovative solutions are needed to address the constraints that limit rural communities from achieving greater economic gains. The Global Maker Challenge on Innovation for Inclusive Trade aimed to find solutions that will enable inclusive trade in rural communities. To do so, the MBR Initiative for Global Prosperity sought applications from innovators and makers around the world that will: first, increase competitiveness and give comparative advantages to communities traditionally left out of trade opportunities. Second, improve the ability of rural communities to move across skills, industries, and regions. Third, facilitate the integration of rural markets with the global economy. And now, please welcome Kamil Shafiq, one of the co-founders of POKET, and winner of the Global Maker Challenge in the category Innovation for Inclusive Trade.
Welcome, Kamil. Thank you for joining.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me.
You're really setting the foundation for any type of commerce. Can you briefly describe what POKET does for us?
POKET is essentially an end-to-end platform for deploying crowdsourcing engagements. So really our focus is on emerging countries where, as we know, there are a tremendously large number of places that are completely offline and unmapped, right? Even if you go to some mega cities like Karachi, Pakistan, or Lagos, Nigeria, you see that even when you use Google Maps, despite the fact that Uber now exists in these parts of the world and we have incredible services built on top of the existing infrastructure, we still have a very, very poor layout of all of the different merchants that exist, whether they be food merchants or informal chemists or pharmacists or cobblers, or the entire informal sector doesn't really exist on any type of digital platform. And so our focus really is on creating a tool that allows any organization to crowdsource data about these types of locations using a decentralized approach.
And so how do you incentivize people to submit the information if it's crowdsourced?
You know, there's a lot of interesting platforms that allow anyone to really input data, right? OpenStreetMaps is a great example where anyone can pick up a phone, a tablet, a browser, and edit a place on a map, add a place on a map, whether it be a street or a point of interest. But one thing we have to remember is that given that our focus is primarily the emerging world, data is a luxury. The average citizen or the average student or the average community member doesn't necessarily have access to data. Even if they do have access to data, it's very much pay-per-use, primarily a prepaid market in the types of places that we work, which is essentially South Asia, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. And so when we look at these parts of the world, we have a really large number of people that are on prepaid plans that are actually paying for every megabyte of data that they use. So it's very much this precious luxury for a lot of people. And so for that reason, we don't really identify with this premise of people are going to contribute data on the basis of altruism, right? When you use apps like OpenStreetMaps or Waze, right, you're really inputting data for the benefit of the community, right? It's a completely altruistic motivation. Versus for us, we believe that because there's a cost that's being expended by each one of these users to generate this type of data, it's only fair that they are also compensated or rewarded in some way. So to answer your question, how do we actually incentivize people? There's a few different ways we use depending on the organization that we're working with. So in places, for example, like Kenya, where mobile money really is kind of the backbone of infrastructure with M-Pesa, it's very easy to do an integration where users, once they map enough places, can redeem their points within the application for an M-Pesa transfer. In other parts of the world, for example, Lagos, Nigeria, where we don't have an incumbent mobile money player, bank transfers are still kind of the main way of transferring money between mobile devices. And so we allow users to actually input their banking information to get a bank transfer. In other cases, like I live in Canada currently, because of the pandemic, I've kind of been displaced. And, believe it or not, despite the fact that Venmo and Cash App have taken off so aggressively in places like the US, Canada still has a really, really cumbersome way of allowing people to transfer money, which is called an Interac e-transfer, which is just a complete, like it's I don't want to bash it publicly too much, but basically it's very, very archaic. It's not easy to transfer microtransactions. It requires an email address and a bank account. So in that case, we would probably use something like a gift card even to incentivize people and let them redeem. So it really differs kind of based on the place that we're looking to generate data for.
Excellent, thank you. You were saying you've got partners in the country. So when you looked at Kenya with mobile money, it means you're not necessarily trying to do this by yourself. You're always having a regional or national partner to tackle the market with?
Yeah, in many ways, we've noticed, especially since COVID-19, that's been something that we've had to lean on more. So before the pandemic, I was actually living in Lagos, Nigeria. We were very much, independently. We started actually with crowdsourcing the healthcare landscape in the state of Lagos. So you can think of chemists, pharmacies, hospitals, clinics, labs, and that was something that we were able to oversee. We had a lot of great folks on the ground that were willing and eager to generate this data, and we were able to map out thousands and thousands of places relatively quickly. But part of that was because we had some presence on the ground. Post-pandemic, what we realized is, built something really interesting that we should be able to launch remotely with a little bit of tweaks and changes to the platform. And secondly, it really requires having a great implementer on the ground who either has a network of people already existing. So instead of going through informal channels, if you already have an NGO, for example, that has a group of young people, or a university who wants to engage their geography students in mapping and cartography, right? There's a lot of really great opportunities to leverage these partners, whether they be universities or NGOs, to generate this type of data. And another thing that we've come to realize is that fortunately or unfortunately, the impact of COVID-19 on youth unemployment globally has been really, really substantial. So I was just reading that 1 out of 6 young people have lost work on account of COVID-19. And that compounds with a place like, for example, Nigeria, where 70% of the youth was either unemployed or underemployed. Right. And so now you have these compounding effects where there's so many young people, many of which are brilliantly smart, intelligent. They're mobile first. They're a young generation who's grown up now with at least an Android phone or some version of social media, whether it be on desktop or mobile. And this is kind of a way to engage young people in task-based work using just their smartphone. One of the things that we often say is that our goal is to kind of transform the smartphone into a vehicle for performing new types of work, which really, if you think about it, hasn't existed. But soon, with the infrastructure changing really quickly, we think that there's an opportunity to make this happen.
Clearly, once you have the user base and the engagement of the people and the information on the stores, the opportunities appear to be limitless. It's more a question of where do you focus, where's the greatest opportunity, or where do you even get traction first. You were talking about how you're rewarding people. Obviously, that costs money. And so how do you generate the funds to pay the incentives?
One of the ways that we work with our partners is through solving a need that exists across a particular organization. Let's use the example of an NGO. An NGO might have a network of young people that is engaged in a capacity training program. So let's use, for example, let's think Karachi, Pakistan. And there might be an NGO there who has a need for mapping out all of the pharmacies across the city. Now, we have this task, and if traditionally we had 3 or 4 enumerators that would travel the entire city, They would get on buses, they would take motorcycles, they would go on foot, and they would walk around and maybe spend months finding every single pharmacy. So for example, Norbert, you're in Tokyo right now, is that right?
Correct.
So imagine you and three other people had to map out every single pharmacy in Tokyo. It would probably take you months, and even then, you might not be confident that you found every single pharmacy. But if instead you had a fleet of maybe 50 people or 100 people that were mapping only the pharmacies within their own communities or their own neighborhoods, you could generate that data set very quickly, more safely, because you're having less interactions, right? One person is not speaking to 30 pharmacists per day. People are staying within their own communities, and also engage a lot more people in that process to kind of generate the concept of citizen generated data is one that we're quite interested in. What we see is that, to go back to your question, there's a lot of different NGOs, public sector organizations, and private sector organizations that have some type of mapping need. They want a map of pharmacies, or a delivery company might want a map of all the food merchants in a city as they expand to a new area they haven't been to before. Or an NGO might want to actually map out areas or hospitals that actually offer female reproductive services or abortions, as an example. Traditionally, these NGOs or these organizations would already have a budget for generating this kind of data. They were just doing it in a very archaic and slow way. So our approach is to say, hey, you need this data set. We've built a better mousetrap in the sense that you can now actually generate this data by engaging a lot more people, rewarding more people for their work, and getting this data generated a lot faster. So pick a wage, if you want to call it that. And we basically say, for every hospital that's mapped, or in your case, for every pharmacy that's mapped in Tokyo, how much are you willing to reward the user? And so once they give us that value, it becomes a parameter that we build into the platform. And then we can then oversee an engagement where every single time, let's say a user maps a pharmacy, they get $1. So that's basically how it works.
Once the data is generated, is there a fee for actually using it?
No, so we very much focus on providing a platform, and our platform has a few different tools. One is that field collection app, which is really just kind of this gamified experience of incentivizing people to map a particular place, which could be, like I said, it could be a water well, it could be a pharmacy, it could be a hospital, it could be a school, but it could also be a piece of infrastructure. It could be a diesel generator. This morning, I was speaking to a researcher who wanted to map all of the print shops in the capital of Sierra Leone, right? Very, very random, but sometimes academic researchers just have these very obscure interests. So the only way to really generate this data is through crowdsourcing. One of the things that we offer is the platform to be able to do it, which is a few different software tools, which I can go into. I don't want to bore everyone with that, but very much we'll give you the platform and you generate the data that you want to. You own the data. You kind of oversee the engagement of all of this data being collected, but we've built this really interesting way to gamify and organize a crowdsourced engagement of mapping.
Now, with some of these data, the challenge as big as it is to actually gather the data in the first place, but then an even bigger challenge might be to maintain it on a going forward basis. So if you set up all the pharmacies in Karachi, as in your example, how do you make sure that it's kept current when new ones pop up or some others might close?
Actually, the largest challenge is around the accuracy and cleanliness of the data, right? Because as you can imagine, maybe I was just criticizing the traditional approach of hiring enumerators, but at least when you hire those enumerators, they're people that you trust, maybe they're employees, they're accountable to someone, versus in this case, it's a lot more open, right? It's a lot more decentralized. And in some ways, any citizen can just download this app and contribute to this data set. So of course, you might have bad actors, right? You might have someone take a photo of a banana peel and claim that it's a pharmacy in Karachi. So a big focus for us has actually been creating tools and solutions that allow us to clean the data in a much more efficient way. An example, if someone takes a photo of something and it looks like it's not what it's supposed to be, so like I said, a banana peel, but it should be a pharmacy, we'll use a little bit of AI to flag that, hey, this place is not what it's supposed to be, or this place doesn't look like what it's supposed to look like. Another example is phone number. If for whatever reason the researcher NGO wants to not only know that, hey, there's a pharmacy here, but also want to contact it for maybe doing a more in-depth interview or survey, or maybe actually sending someone to purchase a drug, then we also have to make sure that those phone numbers are not just fabricated, but someone has actually checked them. So we have a lot of work that we've done around cleaning crowdsourced data. And to answer your question, how do you kind of maintain this data set once it's generated? We've built a few features that allow users to report when a place is either no longer open or no longer there. You can almost think of it like how Waze works, but in a much more basic way, because keep in mind that we've really built this platform for low-cost Android devices in the emerging world. So don't have obviously all the bells and whistles and great features, but in theory, similar in the sense that if you're in an area and that update is no longer relevant, then you can update the platform by this feature that we've built called Verify, where you can either take a photo and prove that, hey, this place actually doesn't exist here anymore, or even give an upvote that, yeah, this place is still here, even though it was mapped 2 years ago by Norbert, for example.
Is there also something about multiple registrations of the same place? So rather than person I trust that's walking around, if I have 3 people independently submitting a pharmacy, for example, there's obviously a higher probability of that actually existing?
Yes, but you've talked about the good case. There's also a bad case. So you're right. Similar to Waze, if 4 people are indicating that there's a police officer on the road, then there's probably a police officer on the road, or it's more likely than if 1 person reported that. In the same way, if we see multiple people map the same place, then yes, it gives us more confidence that sure, this place indeed exists here and it has a similar name and the same phone numbers that entered. So yes, it's a vote of confidence in many ways. But when you think about data sanitation side, what that sometimes results in is 4 of the same place entering the database. And so if there's an NGO who wants, a database of all of the pharmacies, then of course you don't want to give them 4 of the same pharmacy again and again and again. So we've spent quite a bit of time creating a tool that, like I said, not only verifies the data, but allows you to merge data. So if 4 people have mapped the same place, then we'll combine those 4 images together. We'll make sure that the name is consistent, that all the phone numbers have been amalgamated into one profile for that place, and then that becomes kind of the entry into the database. So in some ways, lots of entries of the same place are good because they give us confidence. But then in some ways, if they actually enter a database without being checked, then they're just duplicate entries, which can be redundant and obviously problematic.
Right, and you have this classic problem of any address or name manager where you have different spellings or
Exactly.
different order of
Exactly.
names, etc.
Right. Totally. And especially in the areas that we work, right, the addressing system is very poor. So geocoding and traditional street addresses are very much colloquial. I'm Pakistani as an example. And, when I go to, for example, Lahore and I ask someone for directions, right, they won't give me a street address. They'll say, yeah, like it's on the left of this tanky. And then once you get to the tanky, look for a lamppost that's red and then take a right there. And there's going to be a guy grilling kebabs on the side of that street. And then that's the corner that it's going to be on. Like that's how addressing and directions work in those parts of the world for many places, especially peri-urban and rural settings.
So were you born and raised in Pakistan?
No, so I was born and raised in Canada, here in Toronto. Spent a little bit of time there. I had the privilege of going on exchange to Singapore, and I spent a few months traveling that entire region, Southeast Asia. And then when that semester was over, when I was a student, I had the option of coming back, but I wanted every reason to prolong my travels and just keep the adventure going. So I convinced my folks, and at the time, there was actually a lot of political instability in Lahore. There was just a really large bomb blast that had occurred there at the time, but I somehow convinced my parents to let me go there, and I actually did an internship for a consumer goods company there for a few months. I was like a 20-year-old kid, but it was a really great experience being able to go there and really, really get insight and with my own eyes observe like how an emerging country operates and functions and all of the opportunities of 200 million people in a country like Pakistan, where more than half of them are completely offline. But we're starting to see like this rapid uptake of internet users almost entirely on mobile devices, which is totally going to change the way that the country operates and is already in many ways. Like I was there when Uber launched with rickshaw, which was like, I think 5-6 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So that was my first kind of glimpse and understanding that, okay, there's a lot of interesting opportunities in these parts of the world. And it's a part of the world that either no one is currently looking at or they're scared to look at. And I think that was the understanding 5 years ago, but now sitting here in 2020, it's easy to say that, yeah, of course, like emerging countries, emerging markets are really where a lot of smart money is going. But 5 years ago, it would be hard for me to sit here and tell you that, yeah, this week, Nigeria had a $200 million acquisition from an American payments company, which was the case last week. But that was unfathomable even 5 years ago, if you think about it.
I mean, especially the Chinese companies, Alibaba and e-commerce and so on, they've been investing quite heavily in Pakistan, I believe.
Yeah, very much. I mean, I would say it's the whole South Asian region. When you look at, for example, Ant Financial, I don't think there's a single mobile money company, whether it be, Bcash or EasyPass or any of these guys, that Ant Financial doesn't have some stake in. Very much they've invested aggressively in really key infrastructure, I think, at the right times. So we'll see how that plays out.
I don't want to digress, but given that you grew up in Canada and for 20 years have been conditioned by Western views, Western press, and also clearly the view that is expressed about countries like Pakistan, how was it to actually be there on the ground, and what did you go through like emotionally?
I've always been someone who's in touch with my culture, so I very much identify with my Pakistani identity. It's something that I've kept dear to me, just the way that I was raised. And even when you look at the rest of my team, right, we're a team really of immigrants and minorities. My other co-founder is Nigerian. He was an international student. We met at university here in Toronto. My other co-founder is an immigrant from Pakistan as well. In that sense, I think our team had this really deep understanding, and I like to say it's an unfair advantage, because I sometimes joke around that, like three white guys that have primarily traveled to Europe would have a really hard time launching a crowdsourcing platform in Lagos, Nigeria. It's just that local nuance and that understanding of emerging economies is really important. In some ways can be learned, but in other ways has to be experienced, or you have to have like so much of that context comes from my parents, right? Or comes from my cousins who I still keep in touch with on a daily basis. So when you go there, yeah, I mean, it's very shocking. The poverty factor is shocking. Just the general organized chaos is shocking, but also brilliant in many ways. And how traditional innovations, my example is Uber. When in the early 2010s, we started hearing about Uber. We started using Uber in a city like Toronto. And then seeing how it was launched in a place like Lahore was just really, really interesting. That they, for example, started offering Uber for rickshaws, where the little icon was a rickshaw, right, within the Uber app. And to me, that was just astounding and really, really interesting. And that for me was like a glimpse into, okay, like there's a lot of incredible innovations happening in the Western part of the world, which can be tweaked for this part of the world, and of course need to be localized and need to be modified in a way that addresses the local nuance of the area. But it's very much possible. Like that was my first observation. And I think the second observation was to kind of see that all of these really brilliant innovations that have taken off in emerging markets, the business models and the technologies are very much, I don't want to say cookie cutter copies, but they're very similar. They're inspired by one another, right? Like let's use the most famous example, which is M-Pesa in Kenya. That was the pioneer of SMS-based mobile money. And then fast forward a decade, it's hard to find today an emerging country that doesn't have a telecom company trying to launch or has launched an M-Pesa equivalent. Whether it be South Asia or Southeast Asia or even Sub-Saharan Africa, like mobile payments based off of the M-Pesa model have now become a part of financial infrastructure for the entire developing and emerging world.
We talk about them as replicants, right? I mean, any idea that comes up anywhere in the world today very quickly is copied. So building something at global scale has actually become so much more difficult. And even Uber has experienced it with like Grab, for example, and Gojek in Southeast Asia. Even a company that is as well funded as Uber didn't have the resources to cover all the globe, and so had to give up these markets to local or regional competition. So with that in mind, obviously you're covering a huge market, which ultimately is 2/3 of the world population or so. How do you make sure that you're not spreading yourself too thin? I mean, I think in our conversation, we talked a lot about, based on the background of yourself and your founders, about Nigeria and Pakistan. I assume then are the first two major markets. How do you scale this now and get more traction all around?
So our focus right now is actually on building great partnerships. And it's interesting, initially before COVID, we very much were of the opinion that, we have to physically go to all of these countries, or like need to hire local teams on the ground to launch anywhere that we want to launch or any country that we want to enter. But then when you approach an international NGO, right, they might be operating in 80 countries simultaneously. And they might have the exact same program across all of these countries, or even if, let's use the private sector, right? A lot of these food delivery companies who want to have data on where all of these food merchants are to sign them up for the platform, many of them have gotten acquired by, the same two or three companies, which I don't want to name on this call, but you know who they are. Think of any food delivery company in the emerging world, they're probably owned by one of three companies, which are mostly based in Europe. When you start having the conversations instead at the local level, but more in the centralized headquarter level, that gives us a really good insight and almost a distribution channel for our platform. Like if we can approach an NGO and say, hey, let's pilot this thing out in, I don't know, Mexico. And if it goes well, why don't you roll it out in the entire Latin American region? And after that, the entire South Asian region. That's a very easy way to scale, assuming that you have a great partner that's innovative and that's willing to launch something like this and willing to learn and willing to invest in innovation, which of course, like when I use NGOs as an example, it's not the best example to use, but there is a lot of great work happening in the ICT 4D space where really great innovators are starting to value, especially at a time like this, right, during COVID, where people are looking for Hail Marys like this, and they're willing to invest in innovative technology that might be untested or might have been tested in the private sector, but is now being passed around in the public sector and the NGO sector. With that said, our focus now, I think before the pandemic was really, okay, like let's go to one country and find all of the interesting opportunities there. But now it's very much no, like let's talk to centralized players who have really good coverage and distribution, whether it be of people or of services, across these parts of the world that we're interested in, and start doing some pilots there and eventually scale to different parts of the world that have opportunity for them, but also I think for us have an opportunity to build infrastructure, like digital infrastructure is what we're doing, mapping all these places for a city, to these really large mega cities. Like I pick on Lagos because just I was reading that at the end of the century, it's supposed to be the largest city on earth, like 100 million plus people. When you think of that, by the time my life is over, it's probably going to be the largest city on this planet. And it's just still shocking that so many places aren't on a Google Maps or don't have any type of digital identity or completely offline and invisible. Right? Someone is going to map these places. So we might as well find the right partners and the right distributors to enable that collection of data, because if we don't do it, someone will.
Is there something where you say you need to reach a critical mass of data by country, certain coverage, and maybe it's even below the country level where you say like a city like Lagos, you need to have a certain coverage for the value to be generally recognized from the application. So you need to have the pharmacies, the restaurants, whatever else people need in their daily life, at least 50% covered. Are there such metrics in your mind?
Those metrics, so that data is actually an output of another really important function, which is the mappers. Because if we don't have mappers, we don't have any location data. So it's a direct function, right? If you can create a community that is engaged, that really likes using your product and actually sees the value of spending a portion of their day mapping places, or is willing to, on their way to school, see a pharmacy, stop for 1 minute, map it, enter that data, if we can build those types of habits, right, that habit forming behavior with a really great digital product that also creates a financial incentive for young people, right, which we think is the recipe for success here. Right now it's a little cumbersome, we have to use bank transfers and mobile money, but maybe there's a world where Facebook Libra actually becomes something that makes sending microtransactions as easy as not even sending a text message, but something that can be totally automated using an API, or a smart contract. So when we think of something like that, then what we really think about is the main kind of concern or main metrics or attention is really focused on creating a fantastic experience for the mappers. And if we can do that, the consequence of that or the output of that is going to be data generated at scale for places that are of interest to either a municipality, a government, a private sector, an NGO. So that's kind of our focus. One is a product of the other. You can't actually get the data without having a user that's really committed and enjoys using the platform.
Yes, they're ultimately saying it's an input question rather than an output question, which
we
of
think
course,
so.
for data is important.
One thing is that it works when it's a large, dense city, but what I'm saying doesn't really apply for like a rural area, right? And like our focus right now is mostly on mega cities and urban centers because of smartphone penetration and urban density and all that kind of stuff. But as I think time progresses, there's like, we've already gotten a lot of interesting requests of, hey, I actually am doing some research and I want to crowdsource the center of farm plots in rural India. Or I want to crowdsource the location of all of the informal chemists in rural Indonesia. So these use cases were starting to come up in terms of our conversations and the demand that we're getting. So our question is, which is the direction we go in? Is it to really map out an urban center with a high degree of saturation? Like, let's try and map out every single thing in an urban center. Or is it kind of, like you said, do we want to spread ourselves out a little bit thinner and allow these other parts of the world, which we maybe didn't have in our sights a few months ago, but there's a demand for it and the partner seems great and they have boots on the ground and they just need a platform to generate this type of data, even though it's in a rural area that maybe is not as sexy for like a food delivery company to want to deliver to, but still has a lot of really great social value. So that's kind of a balancing act. And we're starting to make our platform a little bit more friendly in rural areas where bandwidth is an issue and we might need an offline mode for data capture and people might be a little bit far removed from any traditional financial system. So those are all the conversations that we're having these days. And hopefully we'll have solutions for them sooner than later.
Are you gamifying the data collection process?
Yeah.
When you were talking, I was thinking like it's a bit like Pokemon Go, right? You walk around
Yeah.
and you get points for everything that you enter,
totally
and
right.
you creep up the leaderboard. And of course, that's something that maybe works better again in a very dense area where you've got the whole school class basically competing to be on top of the list for the class. But then it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Like all of those examples you used are the same ones that we sometimes use as well. So there's a leaderboard. So for example, if you've mapped the most places in a month, you're on top of the leaderboard and maybe there's an additional accolade for mapping the most places in a month. For example, some NGOs or some organizations just want to run this thing for 3 months. They want 3 months where they want to map out, let's say, every single pharmacy in the entire city, right? And it's almost a race because at the end of the day, it's a finite resource. What you described earlier in the call, yeah, like 3 people can map the same thing, but only one person is going to get rewarded for it, and it's going to be the first person. So it's like there's this race to map out all of the different places in the city, and as time progresses, there's less and less, and they become harder and harder to find because the easier ones that are on main streets have been mapped already by someone else. So you're completely right. There's a leaderboard, it's gamified, it's incentivized, and there's this idea of scarcity as time progresses where there's less and less places that are available to map. So the first person who becomes the mayor of that town, like I know that, what is it, Foursquare used to use this term around mayorship, right? The person who checks into the places first, right? I don't know if you remember Foursquare, maybe I'm aging myself. They were, I think, the pioneers of this concept of mayorship, where the first person to check into all of these places or particular place was the mayor of that point of interest or that shop or whatever. So in the same way, right, we can actually see who the user is that's been mapping the most. Like we sometimes look at our data and we see that there's some users that are mapping like 60 places a day. Like they've transformed their full-time job into just running around and mapping. And in many cases, the average daily wage that they're getting from that is 4 or 5 times that of the average daily wage of, the average citizen, which is for us really exciting because it's, again, like this interesting new form of work. And if someone wants to dedicate their time to do that, they'll always get rewarded for their input or the data that they generate. So it's really, really interesting. And you're totally right. The gamification bit is one that I think we're still working on. We have a lot of room to improve it. But at the same time, we've seen so many other platforms and applications use some of these gamified experiences and drawn inspiration from so many different gamified apps where we don't see it as much in emerging countries, but hopefully we find a reason to. And hopefully this is one of them.
I mean, the flip side of the gamification or even like the time limits is that, as you said, at the beginning, it's relatively easy. And then almost the 80-20 rule, right? The last 20% take you 80% of the effort. And how do you actually get a completion? Because if you have many challenges running in parallel, it's much easier to cover first 80% with 20% of the effort than the tail of the data gathering.
I think it's a challenge that we still face, right? Sometimes like we don't know when it's done. It's funny because if you go to these parts of the world, like I used to do this the very first time I went to Nigeria, our first week, we went into one of the largest markets, not even in Nigeria, like in sub-Saharan Africa, it's called Idumota Market. Tens of thousands of merchants. They don't even advise tourists or non-locals to go there. But of course, like we wanted an adventure. So we went in and on the way, we kept asking throughout that whole week, like anyone that we knew, like, hey, should we go to Idumota? And we would always ask them the same question. We would say, how many merchants do you think are in this market? And they would always give us the exact same response in one word: uncountable. It's uncountable. There's no way of knowing. So that's kind of the difficult part of all this, is that because these places have never been mapped before, we really don't know when we've reached that 100% mark, right? And the 100% mark can change on a weekly basis because, like you said, things can open and close. So for us, it's really a matter of getting as much coverage as we can. One thing that we've started to do is we get an indication that we've reached saturation when stuff starts to turn red, in the sense that when everyone starts duplicating the same entries again and again and again, and we're not seeing a lot of net new entries that have never been mapped before, that kind of tells us, okay, I think that we've gotten a pretty good coverage because everyone is now starting to map the same place again, and we're not seeing a lot of net new places enter the database. So that's like one indication that we use, but it's hard to say, right? There's no way of guaranteeing that, okay, yeah, every single pharmacy in this 250-kilometer radius has been mapped and mapped accurately. It's just kind of a function of using the data that you have and running some intelligence to infer what percentage of saturation you think you've hit, which is, I think, something that we're still learning as a team.
The last question really, and the origin story. So how did the idea come up? How did the team come together? What ultimately was the trigger? Because you were in a classic job in a classic company before you founded this startup.
Yeah. That classic job and classic company was actually foundational, because at the time I was actually working in location analytics in a telecom company here in Canada. And it was around kind of understanding, how do we look at mobility data, right? The way people are moving around a city, of course, in an aggregated and anonymized fashion, right? Canada's very conservative in their approach to privacy, especially relative to, let's say, the US. Kind of looking at that data and understanding, okay, like what are the different inferences that we can draw around just regular transportation, or maybe, let's say, if there's an emergency or disaster, how people evacuated a city, or people that are walking by particular billboards or whatever that might be, that use case at a very high level. We were just kind of exploring it because in the US, a lot of telecom companies have done this, right? Like the Verizons of the world. And so that was my first kind of understanding that, okay, location data is very, very powerful. As I actually was doing this rotational program, I was like a new grad, I got this really great opportunity to almost do like an entrepreneurship tour within Pakistan. So I spent 4 months, I traveled the entire country, visited all the entrepreneurial hubs. We were doing some work in the health space there. And that was like my eye-opening moment of, okay, I was interested in entrepreneurship, and now there's this added lens of emerging markets. And then the back of my mind, I was like, oh yeah, like the only thing I've really worked on with a lot of experience is location analytics. Right? So it was kind of like the start of this recipe of, okay, emerging markets, entrepreneurship, location data, right? Which is kind of the building blocks. I came back, I'm on my floor working. This is again like downtown Toronto, regular office. And I look up and I actually see a friend that I have from university who happened to be in the engineering school. And this guy, like I said, is a Nigerian student who I actually went on a tour to Israel with while I was an undergrad. They had this really great exchange student where they took the business students and engineering students and sent them off to Israel for a month to do an entrepreneurship tour as well across Haifa and Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and all these different places. So we became friends there, came back and then reconnected. He happened to be he was actually working at a contractor for the telecom company, like the software development work that they contract out. So then we meet up and I tell him, hey, like, I just went to Pakistan and this place is just, there's so much opportunity and no one really knows about it. And he's like, man, like everything you're describing, Nigeria is exactly the same way. Right. And when you look at these two countries, Nigeria, Pakistan, they're so similar. 200 million people. I think it's 60% of the residents are under the age of 35. So very young population. Internet penetration, like around the time it was around 20-30%. So really small amount of internet users, but growing rapidly all through mobile. Had similar issues with public infrastructure, general mistrust in the government. Like so many parts of it are the same. And having lived in both of those countries, it's totally spot on. Like sometimes if I close my eyes and open them, I would just think I'm in Pakistan or Nigeria. Like sometimes you can't even tell the difference. Again, based on some ignorance from where you're living, but overall, that was my experience. So all of those things kind of led us to getting in a room after work and thinking to ourselves, okay, like what are some of these challenges that exist? And I think we both arrived at, it was really this idea of financial exclusion, right? Like 1.5 billion people are not part of a traditional financial system. How do we create a way to include these people really easily? And the beginning of that was, okay, blockchain is this decentralizer, this leveler of the playing field, right? There's no other way that people will get included in the financial system because they're so anti-establishment. They don't trust institutions like banks. This is the only way to do it. And then we soon brought in another friend of mine who I met through some work that I was doing in Pakistan. And she was like, happened to be an instructor for blockchain at the time, like teaching in some universities. So then we brought her into the group, and then the three of us just started this journey. Started off, like I said, focused on financial inclusion. And then as we progressed throughout some of these programs, really focused on location data and specifically around emerging markets and all of these unmapped places. Like we think, and I think we still do, that when you look at the billions of places that remain unmapped today, right? As an example, like there's estimated to be more than 1 billion merchants, right? Just merchants that are offline and unmapped on our earth today. the entire informal economy. Like I think 40 or 60% of the entire adult population is part of the informal economy. So this entire population is ignored, and we still think to this day that the only way to map out all of these places, it's not going to be one person or one company doing it. It needs to be decentralized. It needs to be crowdsourced. There's no other way that this data will get generated. And I think that was the premise that we all aligned on and moved forward with. And still, I think that's the premise that exists today, right? Like I said in the beginning of this call, if you want to map out all of the pharmacies in Tokyo, you're not going to do it on your own, right? It takes a village. It takes an entire city to be able to do that, as it should. So that's really, I guess, the origin story. There's a lot of twists and turns along the way. You know, COVID, of course, put a pretty interesting wrench in our plans. But you know, like any startup, like any company, we've kind of taken some time to really self-interrogate and introspect and think about what it is that we want to build and how we can build it remotely. And I think it has resulted in an even larger opportunity than we would have been able to see a year ago. So knock on wood, you know, maybe a couple of years from now, I'll talk to you and we'll be on to the next thing. But for now, you know, this has really been an interesting adventure so far. And again, I think it's also thanks to enablers like yourself who give, you know, small startups in different parts of the world a platform to share their ideas and speak about the work that they're doing. So, you know, thanks for having me on. And again, I appreciate you spending some time with me today and love the show.
Super interesting story. And thank you for sharing it. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. It was wonderful.
No, thank you. Thanks so much for having me on. It was a privilege to be speaking with you.